Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on commuting, people and place, critical reflections from practice and implications for policy. My name is Bernie O'Donoghue-Hines and I'm a head of research with the Local Government Management Agency, and I've been working with the LGMA since 2018. The LGMA, it's predominantly funded by local authorities, and we facilitate a number of shared services across the sector. But one of our primary roles is to work in partnership with local authorities to coordinate policy implementation and inform policy development through the use of evidence, which is why events like today are so important to us. So commuting, people and place, the theme of the webinar series, it impacts on many of the operational functions of local government, but the presentation and discussions today will also be of particular interest to the newly established National Town Centre First Office, which is located in the LGMA. So today's webinar is the fifth and the final event as part of the ICLRD's 2022 webinar series on post-pandemic planning for placemaking. A series that has been running since May, and the details of all the previous events can be found on the ICLRD webpage. That's www.iclrd.org. Now, just by way of housekeeping, today's event is being live streamed through Maynooth University Social Science Institute's Facebook page. And a copy of the recording together with speaker presentations will be available on the ICLRD website shortly. So the phenomenon of commuting has for many of us impacted how we live and work. It has brought about a new spatial relationship between homes and workplaces. It has shaped how we identify with place, its social capital and well-being outputs. Commuting too can be impacted by unforeseen shocks and stresses. So COVID-19 and its associated restrictions produced dramatic change in commuting patterns. Prior to COVID-19, the idea of reducing the need to travel by, for example, encouraging people to work from home or telecommuting, or working remotely from anywhere, the teleworking, received limited policy attention. Nevertheless, the large percentage of people working from home during the pandemic demonstrated how rapid adjustment of work practices and patterns can be accelerated by digital technology. The kind of long-term impact this might have on commuting is still a matter of debate. So the event today builds on last month's webinar, which focused on commuting, people and place, the emerging perspectives from the In Place project. As many of you know, the In Place project is examining the effects of outward commuting on small settlements, using a case study approach focused on selecting communities from across the island of Ireland, so that's Northern Ireland and the Republic, and the state of Maryland in the US. And the LGMA are delighted to be associated with the In Place project as one of the key funders. Now, today's webinar considers the implications of changing work practices and the potential for growing home and remote working to alter commuting patterns, to bring about mobility shifts and revitalise small towns. More broadly, it has implications for climate change, for quality of life and broader regional development. This webinar will draw on emerging research and practice from both the Nordic countries, the island of Ireland, and considers the implications for future policy across a range of policy domains. So we have three speakers here today. The first, Mr. August Bogenson, and he's the research fellow with Nordregio. Apologies, August, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. And August is going to speak about remote work and multi-locality post-pandemic and drawing on insights from small Nordic towns. And that's followed then by a presentation from Anna Desmond, who's assistant economist in the Economic Policy Centre in the University of Ulster. And she'll be speaking about the future of remote working in Northern Ireland. And then David Clemens, the Senior Land Use and Transport Planner with the NTA, will speak about transport planning implications for increased remote working. So the speakers will describe three excellent interventions, each with a slightly different focus. And once all three have presented, we will then have the open discussion. So please post your questions throughout the afternoon as the speakers are speaking, but post them in the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. So the chat function isn't enabled, it's only the Q&A function. But first, to kick us off with a few words of welcome is the chair of the LCLRD, Ms. Mary McIntyre, OBE.
Thank you, Bernie, and good afternoon, everybody. And as Bernie said, this is our final webinar in the 2022 series. And this one follows on from a very successful one we had last month, which also dealt with the issue of commuting people in place, and looked at the ongoing research that Bernie referred to. For those of you who aren't familiar with ICLRD, we are a North-South US partnership between 3 universities, Ulster, Maynooth, and University of Maryland. And we were set up in 2006 to explore the contribution that spatial planning and the development of economic, environmental, and social infrastructure could make to peace building in Ireland and elsewhere. And one of our key objectives is to strengthen the linkage between policy and practice to inform central, regional, and local government policymakers and practitioners. So therefore, research such as we're about to hear today is really at our absolute core. And I'm personally looking forward to the presentations because this has been an excellent series of webinars. So I'm not going to really take up any more of your time, except to say that webinars such as these don't just happen by accident. As Bernie said, this is our 5th this year. So really, as the chair of the organization, I really want to pay tribute to our director, Caroline Creamer, who has put all of this together, to all our facilitators, not just to Bernie and to our 3 speakers today, but to all our facilitators and all our speakers who have very generously given their time and shared their insights and their experience and been very open and generous in their question and answers, and really delivered excellent presentations throughout the year to all our audiences. And they're all available afterwards on our website, iclrd.org. So like yourselves, I'm going to sit back now and look forward to presentations from David and Anna and Auguste with great enthusiasm. And thank you all very much for your input today.
Auguste is a research fellow with Nordregio, the International Research Centre for Regional Development and Planning. He's an environmental social scientist. He has an academic background in political science and social anthropology and favours working on the intersections between research, policy, practice and implementation. Auguste's research interests include policy and governance of the Nordic countries and Arctic, sustainable rural development, the labour market, local participation in policy processes and tourism studies. He is also interested in international affairs, globalization, creative industries, and social innovation. His professional background lies in media, communications, and the labour market. So Auguste, very welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for inviting. Thank you so much for inviting me. Glad to be here. So, you should see my presentation now. If not, somebody please let me know. But as you mentioned, Nordregio is a research center established by the Nordic Council of Ministers. Just to get that shortly out of the way, we are an intergovernmental research institute focusing on rural development and urban planning in the Nordic countries. That would be Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, along with the autonomous regions of Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Åland Islands. The Nordic Council of Ministers is located in Copenhagen, but we as a research institute are located in Stockholm, Sweden. I myself am originally from Iceland, but have lived for many years in Denmark as well, and now located in Sweden. So this research I will briefly introduce has been going on for about a little over a year now, and it's still ongoing. We've already published 2 reports to be found on our website, nordregio.org. And today I'll present some findings from them and maybe a little look into what we're doing in the next steps. So we're now working on phase 3 of the project, doing case studies in each country along with cross-border case studies. But anyway, in the project, we're less interested in remote work per se and more interested in the potential effects on cities and regions and the background for the project. And what it derives from is looking into the future of remote work. Is it here to stay? Potentials, as we can only look at the spatial trends that took place during the pandemic at this point and think about although they will be continued. And then the policy context, how are the governments reacting, and what are the links to policy prior to the pandemic? And we spoke to representatives from unions, business associations, reviewed surveys and literature from all the countries, and by all accounts, the expectation was that even after the pandemic, we will work remotely more than we did before. But not all the time. All the studies carried out in the countries I mentioned earlier, between half and 2/3 of those working remotely expressed a desire to continue to do so at higher levels than before the pandemic. But very importantly, very few of these people wanted to work remotely all of the time, and most favored working from home about 2 or 3 days a week. So this suggests that our ability to make the hybrid situation work will be quite important in predicting whether this trend will be maintained. And this is, of course, an important consideration from a planning perspective. What we do at Nordregio is using the Geographical Information System, GIS, quite a lot. So we developed quite a few maps on the data we have, and we see that remote working is, of course, not for everyone. Most people cannot work remotely. We developed this map to get a picture of the proportion of jobs in the Nordic municipalities that can be done remotely, and it was on average a little over 37% that can be conducted remotely. And this is a theoretical potential. So all jobs that possibly could be done done remotely are classified under this. So we see from the map also that this is mainly an urban issue, because the darker the blue color, the higher the percentage of those jobs that can be done remotely are, and they're concentrated around the capitals and the big cities in the Nordic countries. But if we move on, the second research question is to look at the potential effects. We're all pretty aware that the long-term implications are far from clear. We try to look at what spatial trends can be identified at this point. So we look at 3 main concepts: mobility, understood here as daily mobility, so basically commuting. Then we have migration, that is permanent change in address within a country, and then what we call multilocality, people dividing their time between 2 or more places. So we see some changing mobility patterns. Here we have mobility data from Google. It shows the first months of 2020. The green line at the top is the pre-pandemic baseline, and as we get from the start of the year and closer towards the spring and summer, we see that we're getting closer and closer to the pre-pandemic baseline, but we never quite got there. On average, about a little over 20% below, and that is actually a trend, according to our newest data, that seems to be ongoing. But we move to migration. One of the bigger questions from the beginning of the pandemic was, what effects will remote work have? Will it create new opportunities for rural regions? So if people can work from anywhere, where will they go? To try and understand the migration in the past couple of years and during the pandemic, we looked at the internal net migration, people changing address within the same country, to understand in a context of what happened before the pandemic and during the pandemic. So also if it was something new going on or just a continuation of the same trend. And this map might be overwhelming and a bit complicated, but if I explain the colors shortly, the blue are areas where in-migration is increasing, the lighter blue, in-migration decreasing, green change from out to in-migration, yellow change from in to out migration. Then the orange ones are out migration where it is decreasing, and then the red ones where out migration is increasing. And what we see from this is an acceleration of out migration from the capital areas and the larger cities. It's not a new trend in the Nordic countries, but a very intensified trend during pandemic. And if we can see it here when we look closer at the capitals, the red color indicates that there's intensified out migration, and then we see all the small or smaller municipalities close to the big cities. They are the blue and dark blue ones, where in-migration is intensifying. Same in Reykjavik, Iceland. In the case of Helsinki, Finland, was a different trend than before. Helsinki was not experiencing out-migration prior to the pandemic, but in-migration, so it was actually growing. But now and during the pandemic, this has turned around, and now there is actually out-migration for the first time in I guess forever in Helsinki, and yeah, now they actually have out-migration. And for the rural regions, another trend we spotted was depopulation slowed down or turned around in many municipalities. In total, about 50% either slowed down their depopulation or turning it around. Those that are orange and green are where it actually turned around. However, several rural municipalities also experienced increased out-migration. So this is not a trend that we can say that all rural municipalities benefited from. And we simply do not know if this is linked to remote work or not. We will simply have to wait a few years and gather more data to be sure. But the trends are quite clear. So anyway, to supplement the quantitative data, we also interviewed a large number of people focusing on planners and local politicians. And in short, there was a degree of uncertainty about what the effects of remote work would have. However, throughout all the countries and all the regions, we also found that participants said that remote working was clearly playing a role in the changes in policy that were taking place or being discussed, and there were indeed high expectations that this would be beneficial for from a rural development perspective. So in the Nordic context, second homes are a common way of thinking about what we called multi-locality. Approximately half of the population of the Nordic countries has access to a second home, either through family or friends, or they own their own. And second homes in this Nordic context is also, should be noted, a cottage or a summer house, not a place that necessarily would be defined as a permanent home. So it doesn't have all the same amenities as a regular home. But anyway, I have to move through this quickly to try and get as much of the messages across as possible. So this is one of the trends we saw during the pandemic, was the rise in sales of second homes. It, however, also correlates with other pandemic trends. People were, of course, not able to travel abroad, but in fact, we see that it started going down again in 2021. And now when we have briefly looked into the data for 22, we are seeing far less sales of second homes. There's a lot on the market, but prices, after going very steeply up during the pandemic, are also going quite fast down again. If I focus on the policy responses in the Nordic countries, this is what we look at lastly. We see different policy responses throughout the countries. In Iceland, for example, before the pandemic, the Icelandic government had a goal of 10% of all state jobs should be specified as jobs without placement. And this was supposed to be done by 2024. So it was a regional policy priority, can we say, before the pandemic. But during the pandemic, it of course gained momentum. Before it was quite an ambitious goal, but during the pandemic, much more achievable, can we say. And now actually during the pandemic and with the new government that took office last year, the discussion has shifted, and a manager now must have a good justification for why a job needs to be at a specific place. And if a manager cannot provide that justification, the job shall be advertised without a particular placement. So when I finish my job at Nordregio in Stockholm and move back to my home country of Iceland, I'll be able to apply for some lucrative government job, hopefully get it. And if the manager there can't find a justification for why I should be placed in a specific place, I can choose any of these places located on this map. This is not a work from home scenario, but these are potential workstations for public employees in Iceland, taken from the Regional Development Institute's website. So even though I would work for an institute that is physically located in, let's say, the capital Reykjavik, I can live and actually go to an office in any of these places. So this is something that existed before the pandemic, but intensified and gained momentum during the pandemic. In Finland, they have a long tradition of these second homes and actually have this multi-locality concept in their rural development plan. The justification was to provide opportunities and improve territorial presence, and the reaction in Finland during the pandemic, therefore, had a strong link with the pre-pandemic policy, and the effects of and potentials are more evident in the Finnish policy discussion. And the pandemic gave this discussion a new momentum, accelerated the development. Rural development plans prioritize regional and local competitiveness in both Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, but there were not specific policies in place before the pandemic about remote work. Nonetheless, there was a strong foundation for remote work. In the Nordic trust measures very high. This is believed to have played a wider role between employers and employees, something that we heard repeatedly during our interviews for this project. And it still does when looking at the continued remote working. Well, here are some key takeaways that I'll skip for now. I'll go briefly use my last few minutes to discuss our next steps in this research. We're now conducting case studies, as I mentioned earlier, and further analysis, as we are also further away from the pandemic. So each month of data we can analyze is incredibly valuable. And we can, for example, see, as I mentioned earlier, that the sale of summer houses has gone down, and prices as well. House prices in small town and rural areas that are defined as houses, not just summer houses or cottages, they went way up in prices during the pandemic. And those are not, at least not yet, going as quickly down as the prices of the summer houses. This has presented problems for some of these areas, as permanent residents have a very hard time or no way of competing in buying homes against economically stronger persons that maybe only intend to use the house for a few weeks a month. And we're doing case studies from two of each of the countries, one rural case study and one urban case study, and as well across some of the border case regions in the Nordic countries. So a new report with those findings, new data should be available next spring. And this is maybe what might be of most interest to you. And we're going to extend this project and dive into the available data now and update what we already have done. But very preliminary findings indicate there's very high expectations associated with increased remote work, and somewhat that still is the case. And as I said earlier, some regions have benefited, others are facing problems, and these problems they did not foresee, such as becoming vacation places when they desperately need more permanent residents. But I think I will stop here and let the next speaker come along. I encourage you to have a look at our reports and maps on our website, nordregio.com, and then at the end I'll answer any questions you might have. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, August, for that. And as I said at the start, we're just going to move on through to the next presentation. Q&A will be at the end. So next up, we have Anna Desmond, who's Assistant Economist in the Economic Policy Centre, and also the Economic Policy Centre as an Assistant Economist in 2020, and primarily works within local government research, labour market analysis, and economic forecasting. Recent research projects have been shaped by current affairs and include UK inflation trends, as well as remote working trends and the impacts of COVID-19 in Northern Ireland. Anna is also involved with teaching in the Ulster University Business School. So Anna, thanks very much. We look forward to your presentation.
Brilliant. Oh, hopefully everybody can see that now. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. So this presentation will talk really about the future of remote working in Northern Ireland, and this stems from a paper that myself and Dr. Owen McGuinness published earlier this year, which is available on the EPC website. So just to set a bit of context around the commuting pre and post-COVID in Northern Ireland. So from the graph on the left-hand side here, we can see that residents that live and work in the same council area, there's 11 of these within Northern Ireland, was very, very high. So people typically have a very short commuting pattern. And this is something that we will maybe revisit as we go through the presentation here, but it's good to bear in mind that people are mostly living and working within the same area, broadly speaking. Some people have the misconception that all commuters are moving to Belfast. Yes, there is a large number. Belfast offers a great number of employment opportunities for everybody across a number of council areas. However, this is less common for those based around geographical proximity. So we see less of that in Fermanagh, Noma, Derry City and Strabane, just as that would tie in well with where they'd be located, really. We can also look into the number of cross-border commuters that are making that journey on a daily basis. So again, geographical proximity plays a large part here with Newry, Morningdown, Derry City and Strabane and Fermanagh, Noma really coming in higher up there. The percentage commuting to Dublin, however, again, kind of ties in with that geographical proximity. We've got higher numbers, maybe in some of these smaller council areas, making that move to Dublin, maybe attracted by higher wages and different employment opportunities south of the border. I think August also used the workplace mobility available from Google here, which we've tapped into as well. It allows us to have a look at this on a LGD level as well. So this is comparing this to a baseline in February 2020. So what we can see is workplace commuting was significantly reduced in January 22. This has come back to the norm, maybe more slightly in October 22, but it's still at this reduced pattern. So we can really see that people are still working from home. There's maybe more of a hybrid normality being introduced and becoming more prevalent throughout organizations. Remote working patterns. So this graph uses data from BICS, which was a great survey that ran throughout the pandemic, usually on a 3-weekly basis it was released. So pre-COVID, we had around 10% of people in Northern Ireland working from home on a regular basis. And these were concentrated in around managerial and professional roles. And as you can see from the graph here, this number sort of fluctuated in line with different lockdowns and protocols that we were receiving from the government. So as you can see, it was sort of a fluid picture. But towards the end, this light blue line at the bottom, which indicated the number of those that were working in a hybrid form, was starting to increase. And this is what we see more becoming much more prevalent and the norm going forwards. This is what we think will be more here to stay. So August looked at the potential for remote working from more of a geographical sense, but we've taken the approach of looking at this in a sectoral perspective. So we have the number of people here in the bars. This is the number of people in each sector in Northern Ireland. The blue diamond then represents the proportion of those that are able to work remotely in practice. So this, however, might not be, they might not be working full time. This could be a hybrid position, but this is the proportion of people that we think could, in practice, in future, work remotely to an extent. And this comes out at around 40% of total jobs in Northern Ireland, which I think is in line with what was maybe in the Nordic region countries there of 37%. However, our in theory estimate is around 61%, but this is more what we saw during COVID, where people were maybe being forced to work from home, the likes of education, health and social work, so maybe wasn't as productive, or the recipients of the service or product weren't receiving quite the same service. And that's hence there's been the push to move back to an in-work setting such as education. We saw the government really putting pressure for schools and universities to return, just so that students could get the most benefit out of that. Survey findings. So as part of our research, we ran a survey that had around 1,600 responses. And we asked questions from commuting patterns to what people have been doing during the pandemic, and then where they see themselves over the next coming months and years. So when we asked people how often they want to return to the office, the majority of people were in and around the 1 to 3 days per week. So again, showing preference for this hybrid model of working. This was maybe more prevalent among younger people. They are seeing the benefits of being in the office, learning from their peers and colleagues, and they were maybe the ones choosing more towards the 4 to 5 days a week in the scale here. But yes, overall, what we're seeing is this appetite for around 1 to 3 days in the office. So Connect2 hubs were a programme announced by the Northern Ireland Civil Service. There hasn't been a huge amount of talk on them recently. It was a bit difficult to provide an update on this. However, they have announced that they will be opening a number of hubs across the country. Actually, from our survey as well, we saw that a higher number of people in the public sector had experienced remote working during the pandemic compared to the private sector, however, still very high across both. We find that with regard to hubs in general, people find that if they had a hub dedicated to their organisation, they might be more inclined to use it, as opposed to maybe just a more general remote working space. There was, however, a mixed appetite for these. Some people, again, coming down to that smaller commuting time, some people were saying that if they were going to leave the house, get ready for the working day, if their commute wasn't that large, why would they go to a hub if maybe their main place of work was only perhaps another 10, 20 minutes, and they would have more colleagues to converse with, and the likes of that. So it'll be an interesting pilot scheme to see how this works, and then whether other organisations maybe take from there or other local governments introduce more of these. So again, some qualitative responses. I believe these will be, I won't go through all of these in detail. I believe they'll be circulated. So these are just some of the responses that we got in and around what people felt around hubs. The qualitative responses more widely on remote working were very mixed. Some of this was maybe to do with more the conditions of under lockdown. People maybe felt more socially isolated. They had children at home that maybe weren't at school. They were having to balance, teaching from home. And and we would like to rerun this survey under what we would call maybe more normal long-term conditions to see how people are finding remote working as a more here to stay idea. So some policy challenges, I'll not go through all of these in detail, but again, just a few things to maybe spark a few questions here. So this idea that the office is here to stay, mixed thoughts around how this would best be used. Employers are obviously worried that, you know, if people are not coming in on the same days, they've still got the electricity, the heating on, all becoming more prevalent in these times. And they also want the collaboration that comes with people coming into the office and trying to concentrate those where it's best used. Whether remote working will be led by the decision to want to work, or whether it's led by the nature of the work. So employees might want this, but is it best suited to what they're working on or their colleagues? It's something that employers will have to manage. Again, the right to request to work, the right to disconnect. These are kind of maybe more HR challenges as well, not just for employers more widely. How this can be offered equally and fairly across organizations when some jobs are maybe more suited to remote or hybrid working than others. Management and well-being issues. Again, remote working was introduced during the pandemic as sort of a need. It was nearly overnight. A lot of managers maybe weren't specifically trained in how to manage remote working, how to make sure a team's still checking in, and their productivity is still remaining high. So again, this is something that we'd really look to see more of going forward. The productivity issues we found, speaking to a lot of employers, this was something they were really worried about at the beginning of the pandemic, was productivity going to decrease. A lot of them have said, you know, they've been pleasantly surprised. Obviously, in some cases, you know, that's a generalization. I'm sure there'll be others that spark either way, but a lot of employers still finding that their workers are producing the work they need. However, whether we've really lost some of that collaboration and innovation that comes from people coming together in the office, that's something that we're still expecting to see the results of over the next couple of months as maybe this hybrid model becomes more popular. A clear demand for home working. Some people see it as a real perk, as again from the Nordic studies there, you know, they're really encouraging employers to offer this as an option, but whether this will be used as a tool by companies in the future to attract and retain staff, again, yet to be seen. But that's something that we do expect to see more of going forward. Lastly, the Zoom shock one is a big, the buzzword over the pandemic here, really. So what the impact will be to some of these maybe commuter towns, and the impacts felt more widely then by the city centre as well. Again, we've still yet to see whether in a hybrid model, say, are people still coming into city centres, town centres? Are they spending the same amount as they maybe would have pre-COVID across a full week? Or are people keeping their spending at home? And what impacts will that have on wider sectors, such as retail, arts and entertainment, and hospitality? So again, a lot of uncertainty here as the overarching theme, I'm afraid. But this is just something that we would like to follow up in the next couple of months, if not years, to see how this pattern really does change and develop over time. It's something definitely interesting that's very fluid and, well, hybrid for want of a better word. But yes, I think that's me for today, but I will be very happy to answer any questions later on, and I hope that's been informative.
Anna. Okay, we move on now to our third speaker. So it's David Clements, and David is the Senior Land Use and Transport Planner with the NTA. David is he holds a BA in Geography and Sociology from Trinity and a Master's in Regional and Urban Planning from UCD. He works in the strategic planning team in the NTA and has recently been project manager for the Limerick Shannon Metropolitan Area Transport Strategy and the Greater Dublin Area Transport Strategy. One of his roles nationally is in the development of local transport plans for sentiments across the country, and in the integration of land use planning and transport planning through the NTA's involvement in city and county development plans, local area plans, and large-scale planning applications. Okay, David, thanks very much. We look forward to the presentation.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks for listening and for inviting me along to do this presentation. I'm just going to talk about the transfer planning implications of increased working from home, or as it's remote working rather than just working from home. I was delighted to see Anna's last point being uncertainty being the overarching theme, because I don't think any of us are really in a position as of yet to give any definitive answers on any implications or the long-term trends. So I'll just start the contents here. I'll talk a bit about propensity for home working. This has been touched on by both speakers already, but some of the data we've got on that as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the propensity for home working first, which was touched on before. The current trends in public transport use. Obviously, the NTA, we monitor all trends on an ongoing basis. The impact on perhaps peak hour commuting, and some of the transport planning considerations that we have to kind of consider and think about as we're doing our job in the NTA, and other organisations as well, local authorities as well, and their transport planning. And maybe touch on some of the wider planning, social and cultural considerations as well of this. This research was done in June 2021, propensity for home working, the desire to work from home, by it was done for the Journal of Transport Geography by a couple of people who work in the NTA, and also Brian Caulfield and Agnieszka Stefanik. It was done July 2021 when, and I think it's very important to remember the times of some of this research. So working from home was still a requirement in the Republic at the time. So that was still in force. So it was a slightly very different, or it was a very different period to what we're in now. So things may have changed. And the focus was on professional office workers. So that graph there below just gives you an idea of the outcomes of the desire for work from home for the Greater Dublin area and outside the Greater Dublin area. The Greater Dublin area is the counties of Dublin, Kildare, Meath and Wicklow. And as you can see there, you know, the GDA, those commuter counties, there was a definite, if you look at this bar here, mainly the 34% there where there's mostly home, it's a bit of an outlier there. So you can see that there's definitely a pattern there. Beyond the GDA in more kind of other counties as well, it's slightly shorter commute times, etc., and shorter distances as well, perhaps, is a factor there as well. And that's borne out by the questions that were asked in the survey. So how does trip length and time impact on the desire to work from home? So if you just focus mainly there on the yellow parts of the graph there, under 30 minutes there, you can see that there's a very, you know, it's 1 in 5 or almost 1 in 4 of people would like to work mostly from home in that commute time belt there. That rises dramatically from the 30 to 60 minutes, and more so over 60 minutes. This is kind of, you know, it seems obvious, but it is kind of the evidence that we require to kind of deal with these issues. And you can see there, if you add those 2 yellow bars with the over 30 minutes, that's 21% of the entire survey set, so the entire sample there. And if you add in the 7% there, which is the people who want to work always at home, add the two of them together, 28% of the entire sample will be either mostly working from home or always working from home, which is a very significant chunk of people. Just in terms of the current trends in public transport use, during the early lockdown, say March 2020, passenger numbers were as low as 6% relative to, you know, a few weeks previous to that. So we all remember seeing the ghost buses, the empty empty Lewises, and empty Darts, and it was, you know, there would be 2 or 3 people on some of them, but it really just collapsed completely. By September 2020, when, remember, we're still in a very restricted scenario, it was back up to about 50%, as people either went back to work or, you know, schools reopened, etc. And it was still very much suppressed. By November the following year, it was 70%. November this year, we now see Dublin Bus are carrying now 96% of their pre-COVID numbers. Bus Air and nationally, the Bus Air and intercity regional services are at 120%. Bus Air and Waterford, which is a separate contract we have, is at 107%, and all the other ones, Go Ahead Ireland and others, are at over 85%. So, you know, it's getting back to what we kind of had before the pandemic in terms of absolute numbers. In terms of the profile across the week, which is also very important for us in terms of transport planning, the bottom left graph, or the left-hand side graph there, just shows all the public transport uses, including rail. I don't know, and that's week 41, 42, and 43 of this year. The main thing to take away from that is, you know, the difference between, say, Monday, Friday, and the middle of the week. There is a difference. It's maybe not massively dramatic. And if you look at Dublin Bus's daily profile, the blue line are the numbers every day just before the pandemic kicked in, and the red line is the numbers a couple of weeks ago. Interestingly enough, Saturday and Sunday are now higher than they were pre-pandemic. There's a number of factors in that, including, you know, late night buses, etc. But this gap here is effectively hybrid working evidence. You know, all the schools are back to normal, all the colleges are back to normal more or less, and people are doing the same trips they did before the pandemic. It's really the only thing that's different really now is the hybrid working. So you can still see it there. Obviously, it doesn't have the impact on Saturdays and Sundays as it does during the week. But it is interesting that, well, to me, sorry, I can see that there's interesting that, like, you know, when you go out there on a Monday and a Friday, that the traffic is much reduced, and there seems to be a feeling out there that Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday are the days that people who are going to the office will go to the office. But in terms of public transport numbers, it's not having this massive impact. But what impact is there is undoubtedly, you know, around working trips. So the impact then on the peak hour commuting. So there is a reduction, as I said, across the board, but maybe not as dramatic as first thought. Road traffic levels have returned to pre-COVID levels. And the simple principle behind that is that road capacity will almost always be used. If you provide road capacity, people will use it. So, you know, this idea of eliminating congestion is just not a realistic thing to do, because people will always drive unless you put in more restrictive measures such as demand management. The daily profile, as you showed there, is similar to the pre-pandemic, but the peak of the peak has reduced on Monday and Friday in particular. And what I mean by peak of the peak is like that period where real congestion is experienced, say, on public transport, that is definitely reduced on Mondays and Fridays. So when you think about like 500,000 passengers per day, you know, if 100,000 of them are traveling at peak hours, and that 100,000 is now at like 80,000 on a Monday and a Friday, that's a massive reduction in terms of congestion, because congestion, it only requires a few percentage drop for the congestion to disappear. So that's kind of what's happening here at the moment. But that has to be looked at in the context of increased investment in public transport in the last couple of years. Connecting Ireland has begun to roll out. Bus Connects in Dublin has started to roll out as well, with increased services, including the 24-hour bus service. So if I go back to the kind of Saturday and Sunday, those late night buses that come after 11:30, 12:30, 1:30, 2:30, 3:30, they're full. Like, they're really busy, and I think that's part of why it's part of why that's actually happening there, and the numbers are going out. So it's hard to kind of, you know, if we had all those services before the pandemic, would we have higher figures? Undoubtedly we would. So we are continuing to invest in public transport, and, you know, some of that increased patronage is coming from that. In terms of transport planning considerations, again, you know, the uncertainty, and, you know, there was a lot of people, I think, during 2020 and 21 who had, they seem certain about hybrid working. They seem certain that this is going to be something that would solve a lot of problems, but it's not. It's not straightforward. Not all the implications, and delighted to see some of the stuff that's been said in the previous presentations. Not everything about this is positive, but just in terms of transport planning, increased trip rates are one of the outcomes. So people are making, some of the research has shown that people are making more trips for other reasons. You know, they're not traveling into work, but they may be doing other trips locally during the day. Commuting accounts for about a quarter of all trips. It's a pre-COVID figure, obviously. So there's 75% of trips. The vast bulk of trips are for other reasons. In terms of car vehicle kilometers, so that's the number of kilometers traveled by private vehicles in the country. Work trips account for 1/3 of those. You know, so we have a lot of focus on the commute, and we have a lot of focus on, you know, congestion and everything else. But in terms of the overall number, and this has other implications for carbon, etc., it's not the be all and end all. It's very important, and it's thing we plan around, because it is the most stressed time of the day in terms of the transport networks. But there is a huge amount of other trips that we have to consider. So, and then on a third point there, off-peak travel accounts for almost 50% of vehicle kilometers across all modes. And that's off-peak. That's between 10 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and between 7 o'clock in the evening and 7 o'clock the next morning. So that's 50%. And these all have implications for our walking and cycling networks and the dominance of the private car at the local level. You know, we've designed our cities and towns and our villages even around the car. You know, we don't go to any Irish town, you'll see car parking dominate the town centres, even in town centres where we've, you know, invested millions in urban realm and stuff. They're still dominated by car parking. So, do we need a greater emphasis on placemaking and the quality of our residential communities? That's kind of one of the outcomes of this, is that, a lot of the focus now is on how do we make, like, whether it's a town, a small town in Ireland, or a suburban area, we need to have a bit more focus on the quality and how we design our networks around, walking and cycling, and just lingering, just, urban spaces and stuff like that, which we have not been historically, well, historically we might have been good at it, but certainly in the late 20th century, we haven't been good at it. The other question for transport planning generally is, how do we justify and plan for large-scale investment in public transport to meet the peak demand for just 2 or 3 days a week? That's a major question. We've lodged applications now for bus connects, core bus corridors. Metrolink is in now. There's more. Dart Plus is in now as well for the western one. And a lot of it is based around, peak demand and how much we need how much capacity we require in the network to carry that peak demand. But it gets more challenging then if it's only 2 or 3 days a week. So again, that goes back to then what I said earlier on with all the other trips as well that need to be catered for. What's the real impact on carbon emissions? Obviously by 2030, over the coming years, there's going to be a major shift in what we have to do in terms of transport to reduce emissions by 50%. I don't think we have any grasp on what that's going to look like and what sort of things will be asked of the people, of the population, to actually reduce it by 50%. Commuting is part of it, but I mean, goods, vehicles, etc., they're all, like, really important contributors to carbon emissions. And what is the real impact of saying, right, if we work from home 2 or 3 days a week? It's been sold as a major sort of benefit in terms of carbon emissions, but what is the real impact? It relates to what I've shown up there. It's only a quarter of all trips, and a third of car vehicle kilometers is the work trip itself. So where will we be in 2025 or 2030? We really don't know. I think it's really this idea of the uncertainty and the more additional research that will be required on a permanent basis as to how this manifests itself and how policies respond to it in terms of transport planning. I think we need to keep a good eye on it and see where we are with it. When we're at 96% of passenger numbers already, in 2022, and COVID is still here, and we don't know what is to come in the future either in terms of that itself, and let alone how we recover from it if it is a full recovery. Just in terms of the wider planning, social considerations, etc., it's not a license for laissez-faire planning. And this has been referred to earlier on as well in the other two presentations. Like, cities and towns exist for a reason. Workplaces exist for a reason. It's innovation, it's collaboration, and diffusion of ideas. The ideas diffuse quicker. That has been altered by technology, obviously, and how we can do Teams calls, etc. But I think there's definitely a realization there that coming together matters. The town centre's first policy obviously sits there with national planning framework and consolidation into the cities and into the towns. And in our kind of, as I referred to earlier on, we need to consider all the other trips we make, school and college trips. If we are to say, thinking about the example in Nordic countries of the holiday homes or the second homes, how are these people then going to get to their retail, leisure, cultural and social reasons? Like, how are they doing this? Are they driving to all of these things because they've moved out of the city? These are things we need to consider a little bit more detail. Cities and large towns are the hubs for culture and social stuff as well. So I think it's really important that we keep a focus on that. And of course, hybrid working does not mean anyone can live anywhere with no environmental consequences. Every trip is carbon being emitted. Even if it's an electric car, it's contributing to air pollution, significantly, because they're heavier vehicles as well. So we need to kind of keep that in mind as well. There's also personal preferences. Someone said to me the other day, we're organizing an event, like a conference event, and one of his quotes was that he's concerned that work culture has become very transactional. We're doing this remotely. None of us are meeting and talking informally, which is fine. It's better than not doing it at all. But it in terms of work culture itself, there isn't the same personal interaction, and I think we need to make more of an effort then to do other things to offset that. There's that's related to social contact as well. Things like new starters. I felt very sorry for a lot of people over the last few years who started in organizations and not had any personal contact with anyone. So that's another issue. If your boss is working from home 4 days a week and you want to be in 5 days a week, it makes things difficult, in my view anyway, particularly for younger people as well. I think Anna referenced that earlier on, that they seem to be more willing to work 5 or want to work 4 or 5 days a week, and like the housing situation. I mean, we just can't talk about working from home without talking about what the home is like, and the situation people find themselves in, particularly in our large cities in Ireland at the moment, with the housing crisis and accommodation crisis, and what way people are actually living and sharing accommodation. I think it's quite a, it's a major part to this, and I think that's what's driving a lot of the reaction from younger people. There's a media narrative, and this may be slightly out of, this may be a point coming from during the pandemic. When we read about working from home and hyper working, who's driving this? Who's actually, who controls that message? Like, let's think about the age of people who are writing about this, the class they're in, and is some of the kind of stuff weighted towards commuters? We do, in my own view anyway, personal view, of course, there is this kind of drive time radio aspect to this. Hundreds of, like, a lot of people walk and cycle to work who aren't listening to this stuff, and there is a world beyond that as well. So I just think that's something that needs to be kind of thought about as well. When you read an article in the Irish Times, who is this person? What agenda? Not agenda. Sorry. What's their background, and what are they talking about? And are they fully aware of the personal preferences of huge sectors of the population who may not be represented as well? So there's just a few kind of considerations there. So it is delighted to kind of hear some of the stuff about the uncertainty and how we kind of, that so much more needs to be learned about this over the next number of years, and it's not as straightforward as we may have thought it was in 2020 and 21. So thanks for listening. I'll wrap it up there, and we'll be open to questions. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Okay, we're going to move on now to the questions and answers section. So we have plenty of questions in already. However, just before we start on the questions, though, I suppose I would just like to ask the panelists generally. You're coming from different aspects, from regional development, from the business side of things, and then the transport side of things. And it would appear that, particularly from the Nordic example, if there is, I suppose, a coherent policy about the role of remote working, that seems to help all the other policy areas, because at least we understand what the role of remote working is at a national level. I'm just curious, from each of the speakers' perspective, which government department do you think the lead should be coming from in relation to remote working, because it impacts on so many? So I'll start with August, because you.
Yeah, thank you. The question, from which branch of government or department? That's hard to answer. Like,
So I suppose what like, you're coming from the regional development perspective. Now, when there are policy conflicts, because remote working has loads of pluses and minuses, they're going to favor some policy areas more than others. So where do you feel the priority needs to be given in terms of the impact overall for society around remote working? What are the key benefits that we need to be focusing on?
So, well, if I speculate about this, I think if like the pre-existing policy with remote work and such, in when I say pre-existing, pre-pandemic existing policy in the Nordic countries, where it is in place, it's always from a regional development perspective. But then so initially it's driven from the ministry that has to do with those affairs. It depends on which country you're in, which ministry that is, if it's a separate ministry or a part of another ministry. But the perspective is always to benefit the rural areas. Then when a thing like COVID happens and we are suddenly driven to this becoming the norm, that of working from home or remotely, it somehow quite quickly became more beneficial and more widely used in the urban areas. So it should be, I think, mainly a rural priority and a rural issue, but as with so many other things, once it became the norm and people actually saw that this was possible and the possibilities were there and everybody was forced to do it, it was mostly used in the urban centers, so it somehow benefited them more than the rural regions. But that, of course, has to do with that there are more jobs in the urban centers that can be done remotely. But now it's mainly the expectations or hopes that, and some of the migration data we've seen has shown that people are willing to move out of the cities and keep their jobs in the cities, but as the data shows, they're not willing to move very far away. So maybe to the municipalities around the cities that are maybe half an hour, 1 hour, no more than 1.5 hours away from the cities. So if that somehow answers it, I hope so.
Yeah, no, it does, August, because it's very interesting that's, I suppose, where it originated, but as it impacts upon different policy areas, some of which may have be more influential and have more clout. It's just interesting to see whether you can hang on to that. So Anna, you were looking at it from the business perspective. I'm just curious about what your view would be from your perspective.
I think it's going to, well, not to avoid the question, I think it's going to have to be a cross-departmental approach, really. You know, not to cross toes onto what David might come in with, but, you know, up here for the Department for the Infrastructure has to be involved for sure in terms of, you know, making that commute possible if people are going to go into the workplace. In terms of remote working and trying to promote that, it probably falls somewhere under the Department for the Economy, you know, trying to promote those jobs where possible for remote working to be completed. You know, if it's that's likely where it is to fall. However, whether government even sees this as something for them to take on, and whether they don't put this down to individual businesses, they could very well take that perspective as well. So it's a difficult one going forwards, but I think again, we'll have to maybe establish more of a norm before government decide to set any kind of precedent.
Okay, thanks, Anna. And David?
Yeah, I'd agree. Like it's definitely cuts across a whole load of sectors, and I think transport has to respond. Like, I mean, our job is to provide for the demand for travel. We can try and control it as well and manage it as much as we can, but if it is something that we just have to respond to, so it would be up to things like I don't even know the names of the departments anymore, but enterprise and finance and stuff like that. And one of the other issues to consider is broadband and stuff like that, and see how well that's rolled out and stuff like that, and what other services are required to allow that sort of hybrid approach to work properly, really.
Okay, and now a specific question for August. So could you give more information on the data used to identify jobs capable of being done remotely? Presumably occupation data, were they based on the ILO standard classification for occupations? You're on mute there, sorry, August.
Sorry, but yeah, very short answer, yes.
Okay, so nothing else, just that classification.
It's that classification, and then just theoretically, if a job could be done remotely or not. So the numbers we're using are strictly theoretical. If a job can physically be done remotely or not. So, yeah.
So you just made a judgment on it, classification by classification.
Yes.
Okay. Then one next then for Anna. Anna, we're in a period of change. What seems to be happening is that new employees are looking to go to places other than remote working. Do you feel that this is all far too early yet to get any conclusions about what this new economic world will look like? I, for one, would worry about collaborative work and the need for socialization in the workplace, and which seems to be a common theme, that we know it's going to be loads of pluses and minuses, but this is one thing people seem to be quite concerned about.
Absolutely. I think this is, again, something that we'll see develop. So a lot of people, maybe as the pandemic, you know, as travel restrictions started to loosen up, some people were taking the approach that they could perhaps work from anywhere if they were working remotely. We've started to see employers maybe tighten that down a bit and say, look, you can work within the country, or you know, there's perhaps tax implications and pay. You know, it becomes a broader issue than just working wherever you please. Again, there's the up and downside. You can argue either way for the pros and cons of being in the office, but I think to an extent, the innovation, the collaboration, the sharing of ideas, it is easier in the office face to face. You can read the room, you know, it's easier to communicate with people. But I think what we saw really is that it can be done during the pandemic. You know, we were taken into this virtual world, and we saw that it could be completed to an extent, but I think people are just maybe appreciating the benefits of in-person work, and how the sort of added extras that you can achieve that can't be really facilitated through Zoom or Teams and somewhere else. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think it does, Anna. I think it does, because it's come up in all the presentations. David had mentioned it specifically as well. I suppose that it's about that loss of capacity for innovation and creativity and so on that people are quite concerned about. So then for David, so is there any data on the times people are traveling? Buses are more busy between 9 and 11 in the morning now than they used to be. So people working at home and traveling off peak perhaps. So I suppose looking for a bit more information about the nuances of the data during the day.
Yeah, I don't have it to hand for this presentation, but we do monitor all that as well. Obviously, there's also household travel surveys and the census, which will tell you when people leave home for work and school and stuff like that. So it is there. So yeah, there is. It would be available. Like the ticketing data is there. It's extremely. It's a massive database, as you can imagine. So it can be looked at.
Okay, so more to come.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, the census is the best thing for that sort of stuff. Really, it
Yeah.
is. It's the census we do is really detailed in that, and it tells you where people go as well, which is a huge advantage as well.
Okay, another question in now from August's presentation. So was there any sense of inequality or resentment for those individuals whose jobs are fixed or cannot move or work remotely? And how much of the remote working is flexible or semi-flexible, i.e. working remotely for a day or two? And actually there's loads of questions here, so I'll start with that anyway. First of all, so did you get any sense of whether people who could not work remotely, whether there was some kind of resentment that they were losing out on some of the advantage that people who couldn't work remotely were having?
Yeah, well, and we're looking more with like the qualitative aspects now, doing case studies and interviewing people more as time has passed about more of these social effects. But what we have found is maybe not resentment, but some interesting findings is also like, as mentioned earlier, people are wondering about the quality of work when people are working remotely, but also the quality of their leisure time, because we found some people talking about that since you can work remotely and in a pre-pandemic world, you would maybe just call in sick and stay at home and be sick. Now you have some sort of this obligation. If you are home and have a cold, you still turn on your computer and answer a couple of emails. If your child is sick and has to stay home from school, you do the same thing. Maybe you have a meeting that you have to go to, and it's really important. So you never allow yourselves really to leave work or take a day off. And this is something that the labor movement, at least in a couple of countries, is discussing. So that's some of the interesting insights we have already, but we are conducting this, so we don't have any actual findings. But these are some of the more interesting things we'll probably look closer into.
Yeah, and August, I think it's a really good example of, the example, for instance, that if you're unwell, that maybe you just stay at home and work. And that's a real obvious, is that an advantage or a disadvantage? It depends which perspective you're coming from. And it does show the amount of policy conflicts that would arise in this area, which is why I suppose if there was an overarching policy about the overall objective behind remote working and what we're trying to achieve, that would be very helpful for trying to make decisions when there are policy conflicts. Okay, so just Anna, what was the workplace mobility tool research that you mentioned?
So this is the workplace mobility that Google mobility study publishes. Now, they stopped producing this in October 2022, as far as I'm aware. However, I did find a link on Twitter to somebody with a program for R that could then still have this produced. And I've yet to actually try it, but if anybody wants that, I will happily share that with them if they want to send an email. But as far as I'm aware, Google actually themselves stopped publishing those updates from October, but they were available throughout the pandemic, which were really helpful.
Okay, and David, hybrid working is one manifestation of flexibilization of working patterns. So flexible working hours, i.e. moving away from the 9 to 5 is another. To what extent do gaps, deficiency in public transport services outside peak periods present a barrier to greater adaptation of flexible working hours?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of something we're trying to address with the investment. You know, it is a challenge, like I mentioned in the presentation, it is a challenge to say going away from that kind of peak at a peak where you throw all your investment into a number of hours a day. But I think it probably can be a barrier in some places. But I think when you look at our kind of bus connects and connecting Ireland, the whole principle behind that is to make things obviously more frequent, higher capacities to meet the demand off peak, including 24-hour buses. You know, it's not just people leaving home at 10 o'clock in the morning. It's people going to work from 10 o'clock at night till 6 in the morning that we need to cater for as well with the all-night services. So it is a barrier in some places, but it is something that we are attempting to address. I mean, the Connecting Ireland, it's not just about the frequency and capacity, it's also the regularity. So you know it's every hour instead of, you know, there's one at 9 o'clock, there's one 20 past 11, another one at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Those type of service patterns we need to kind of pull back and regularize them a bit more. And as I said, with the climate change obligations, we're going to have to do a lot. We're going to change our lifestyles a lot over the next 8 years, and that'll be one of them.
So to some extent, while COVID was quite a shock, and it did, I suppose, move us out of traditional patterns, it would sound like like from a policy perspective and your operational plans based on that, this move to spreading out transport options was something you were going to work towards anyway.
Oh yeah, I mean, like these things were like Bus Connect, say for Dublin, started in 2017. You know, and one of the core principles of that was that we would have regular off-peak services throughout the day, on all the main services, rather than sort of, you know, it would be every 15 minutes rather than, you know, every 40 minutes, 20 minutes, you know, the way things were in some services. And that's been going on for a long time. It's not just under Bus Connects. I think previous changes to services have been a bit more regularized. So yeah, it was a lot of things that happened in COVID, you know, where things like better investment in cycling and walking and public realm, they were long-standing objectives of you know, local authorities and the NTA and other people, and I think, you know, using the pandemic to get those things in place, you know, you've seen what can happen there. So it confirmed a lot of the policies we need to do anyway, particularly in terms of climate change, which is finally being taken seriously, I think.
Yeah. Okay, Anna. There's, I suppose, commentary about certain jobs that cannot be done remotely. And like from a business perspective, particularly when you look at the service industry, will there be a kind of shift where people will be moving from one type of occupation into another so they can specifically work remotely? Because I know there's been huge difficulties in the service industry trying to retain people who had to go in and work weird and wonderful hours sometimes, that when they got the taste of being at home, working regular hours and so on, that they've left that industry. Is that something that's coming up through your research or something you're aware of?
I think it's something that we're definitely aware of as a wider trend. Now, whether the move out of, say, the hospitality sector for the unsociable hours is being drawn from the work from home perspective, or the work remotely, as opposed to just having more sociable hours, it would be sort of difficult to distinguish there, but it's something that we could maybe look to ask in the future. But we wouldn't maybe be necessarily drawing a correlation between the two at the moment, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. It's something to consider, absolutely. But it would be a bit early to try and tell as well. And I know hospitality are really looking to recruit and fill vacancies, and sort of what way they'll go about this, whether it'll be an increased wage remuneration or slightly more sociable, shorter shifts, whether that's something they'll turn to in the future, who knows. But yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye on going forwards.
Okay, and August, you talked about Iceland and the prior to this, their policy around having to justify why a job wouldn't be remote. Can you explain to us why Iceland adopted that policy? Like, what was their objective there?
That was strictly a rural policy objective. So it was mainly to move state jobs from the city of Reykjavik to the smaller villages around the coast of Iceland. So one part of it was moving, and it also worked in a way that entire institutions were moved from the capital to other parts of the country, but also to make those adjustments smoother, that people that were based in the capital and had their network there and had lived there all their lives could also continue to work at that institution from the capital, so they wouldn't have to get an entirely new staff. So it worked both ways, but the perspective and was driven from a rural perspective, definitely, for a rural development perspective.
Okay, so I mean, that's a really good example of a well thought through policy, and they knew why they were going to do it. Now, we're like, as soon as you talk about remote working, one of the themes that comes up constantly is the potential loss in innovation or cooperative working and so on. So at a state level, they made that decision. I have to assume that they did some thinking about this possible impact. Can you fill us in on what their thinking was, or whether they thought the trade-off was worth it, or whether that did actually happen, whether there was a reduction in cooperative working and innovation and so on?
I haven't heard about any such reports, or even that they had done any such research on the quality of the work. But it started very gradually with a few jobs, but it's accelerated now during COVID. No, but they haven't done any analysis of the quality as I know of as of yet. But there were quite a lot of concerns, especially when moving an entire institution from the capital elsewhere and losing a lot of institutional memory with the staff that then would find other jobs.
Okay. So it would be interesting, because it is such a concern. It would be interesting, I suppose, research could start looking at that. It's a very interesting area. And then just Anna, the Connect to Hubs. So it was quite interesting that people weren't overly interested in just being in a hub, unless it was more of the same, like almost a mini work environment. So back with their colleagues and so on. Do you think that is somehow because they're really looking for a replication of what they already had, except on a smaller version, because it's what they're used to? Or what could explain why there was the reluctance just to be in a hub that would have people other than their own kind of work-related colleagues there? Or was it this piece where, if we're going to be in a hub, at least we have this innovation opportunity or cooperative opportunity?
I think that's what it comes back to. If people thought that they were going to make a journey that wasn't to the workplace, they'd want to at least be able to, maybe have that meeting face to face, or be able to talk to a colleague that they're working with, or perhaps we have a number of placement students that we found having them back in the workplace. The number of things you can just show them sitting beside them at the desk is so much easier than, maybe exchanging a number of Teams messages backwards and forwards to sort out a very small issue. So I think a lot of people were really seeing that if they were going to have to make a journey, it may as well to have been to their main place of work, and then just as well, having that dedicated to their organization so that they could work with people that they were maybe associated with more closely. That's as much as we can assume for now, I suppose.
Yeah, because it was interesting that, I suppose, anecdotally, a lot of people have been saying that young people really want to be back in the office. So your evidence actually shows that. I thought what was quite interesting is that everybody else thought the young people should be in the office too. We're also concerned about their mental health and social development. So older people, so the more mature workforce, not as keen to go in, but I suppose it'll be a case of everybody having to go in for a period of time. It's that want to, have to kind of piece that needs to be balanced. Because,
yeah, so sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
because I suppose what's the point of the young people being in there if it's only young people?
No, absolutely. I completely agree with this. I think this, as I said, this will come down to sort of establishing a norm, whether that's through like an HR regulated policy or whether it's voluntary between, you know, an individual one-to-one basis between an employee and their manager. But yes, there will have to be some sort of organization to make sure that, you know, people are in the office and trying to coordinate those days as well to make sure people are getting the most out of the days that they maybe are in. I think David made a really good point about the new starts, you know, that's been difficult for people to start in an organization. For those that have maybe been in a job and they're very established in their role, it's been maybe easier to take that work remotely. Hence, there's maybe more of a reluctance to come back in if they feel that they've been able to perform their duties satisfactorily during this period. You know, and they've maybe had the reduced commute and they've had other working from home benefits. There perhaps is that reluctance on that front. But yes, that'll be down to managers and office workplace coordinators to ensure that people are maybe coming together and sort of fulfilling the benefits of being back in the office at the same time.
Okay, August, you said across the Nordic countries that some of them have quite advanced policies in relation to regional development, and yet others haven't. Have you seen that where there is a very good policy in place, that there's more, I suppose, structured and beneficial growth of remote working, like it's being managed in a better way than in a place where there is not a regional policy in place? Like you said, Denmark, the links were less clear. So is remote working just emerging there as opposed to trying to put a bit of structure on it and ensure that it's achieving your goals where there is good regional policies in place?
I think it also has a lot to do with scale, though, because even though the Nordic countries are quite similar in governance structure and such, they're very different. For example, Denmark is a geographically very small country compared to Norway and Sweden, who are geographically very large. So, for example, in the Danish case, distances are usually so short that their perspective of rural and distances is totally different than that of people in Sweden. In Denmark, they find 30 minutes quite a long commuting time to a job, because you can drive over maybe 1/5 of the country during that time. But while Swedes consider a 2-hour ride may be okay. So that's quite different. Also, when we say across the Nordics, you also have to take into account that the Faroe Islands, Åland Island, Greenland, and Iceland as well are, of course, macro nations, and they also only have 2 levels of governance: the governmental and then the municipal level. And in the larger 4 countries, a lot of the rural and regional affairs are actually with some sort of regional authorities. So that's also a difference. So I would say what we see here also is that the overall rural policies for the smaller countries are much more developed and specific in their tasks and place tasks on specific places and authorities in a much more detailed way than the larger countries, which is more of an overall, can you say, umbrella regional policy, which then is implemented by either regional authorities or municipal authorities. So that's the main difference there, I would say.
Okay, so we're getting near the end. So I'd just like, I suppose, to focus in just right at the end here on the impact of remote working on possibly increasing marginalization. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, because we know there's pros and cons, but we know, like we're saying, between 37 to 40% of jobs can be done remotely. And we do know from other research that they tend to be more the professional grades and so on, and that people who aren't in those jobs are losing out on that. So if you could ask each of you just to give your views on really what needs to be managed to ensure we don't end up actually increasing marginalisation through this new development from a policy perspective. I'll just start with you, David.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously it's not something that would be a major transport planning view to bring to it, but I mean, it's certainly from sociology and everything else and geography point of view. Personally, like it's definitely, there's a sense of, there is always an overarching requirement for social justice and all these sort of policy decisions and stuff like that. So I think it's a very big point. I think it was during the pandemic. I mean, it was absolutely bloody obvious when you looked at health workers and cases of all that sort of stuff, and the absolute injustice between people working in professional jobs. Some of these jobs we do, they're not that important, you know, and these much more important jobs are the ones people are traveling to day in, day out, as we called them during the time, essential services. And they're still essential services, and they still need to be, you know, are people now driving and looking at fuel prices? I mean, like if you're working in an essential service on a certain wage and you have to drive 50k each day to get there, the amount that you're spending on petrol is going to be huge. That's adding to the cost of work and everything else. So there's myriad issues around that, and I think it is something that will have to be looked at, whether the tax systems or whatever mechanisms governments have to address these need to be examined. And I think the biggest thing about this is we're still in very early days of post-pandemic. It's very difficult to make any kind of policy decisions. Okay, the urgency of 2020 isn't there in terms of like shutting down stuff or making decisions very quickly, but certainly the issues are still there. And with what's going on in the world at the moment, where we have to balance what we need to do on climate change with an incoming recession, or sorry, not incoming recession, but certainly a cost of living crisis we're living through now. I think they're all adding up to this kind of you know, there is definitely that idea of how we rebuild social capital after pandemic has been kind of thrown out a little bit by the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis. So I think it's something we really have to be careful about.
So I'm just aware of time, David, so I'm just going to move on quickly.
No,
Okay, Anna, just very quickly.
David touched on it well there. We're in a position to make long-term plans instead of under emergency circumstances. Sadly, though, I mean, some jobs are just at the end of the day more tailored to being able to work remotely than others. You know, a surgeon, for example, they have to be there in person. A bus driver, you know, there are some jobs that just cannot be done from home remotely. But I think the real key issue is where they can be done remotely, that they are offered fairly, and there are opportunities. Nobody's discriminated against in being offered the option to work from home. But sadly, I don't see it as, you can't get around the problem that some jobs are just not adapted to it, which we did see throughout COVID.
Okay, and finally, August.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add to that, but I can complement what David said a little bit. For example, from an example in Sweden, where this year they were going to take away a tax subsidy for those that have to travel to work. Historically has been, if you have to travel over a certain amount of kilometers towards your workplace, you're allowed to get a reduction on your tax each year. That was going to be taken away after 2022 for environmental reasons, but partly because of the situation, the high gas prices and so on as it is, but also partly because of just fairness towards people that have to physically go to their work every day. They've extended this possibility of getting reduced taxes if you have to travel for work. So that's one small example of a government intervening and trying to have some fairness towards those that have to at least go to work.
Okay, thanks very much, August. Now, apologies for running over slightly there. So look, thanks to everybody for attending today. As noted earlier, all materials relating to the afternoon's events will be available shortly on the ICLRD website. Thank you for your participation throughout the series. Details of the previous events are also on the website. That's www.iclrd.org. ICLRD will be back in 2023 with a new series. Keep an eye out on the website and social media for details. No doubt this series will pick up on this theme of commuting and placemaking and the In Place project, which will conclude this summer. So bye for now, and thank you everybody for your participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.